RBCC, and I'm delighted to welcome Sergei Guriev, an old friend of the Chamber and currently the Scientific Director of Sciences Po's Master's and PhD program in Economics. Sciences Po, of course, being one of the foremost research universities in the world. Many thanks as well to our members and friends for joining us today. Before we get started, the usual short explanation as to how today's webinar will run. After I finish, Sergei will make his presentation. I'm sure many of you will have questions for him, so please put those to him through the chat function. The team will be monitoring them and we'll try and pick out some of the more popular themes. You're welcome to ask Sergei any questions you may have directly, and if you wish to do so, please use the hand up function, the blue hand on the app. I'll let you know when you should ask the question. And of course, unmute yourself when speaking, but if you're not speaking, for everyone, please keep yourselves on mute. We will be recording the webinar and we'll post it on the website afterwards. We'll also post out Sergei's presentation should you wish. I hope that's all clear. Sergei Guriev will be known to many of you as one of Europe's leading economists. Before taking up his current post in academia, Sergei was chief economist at the EBRD between 2016 and 2019. His academic pedigree is second to none and includes stints at MIT, Princeton, and the New Economic School in Moscow. His research interests include contract theory, corporate governance, political economics, and labor mobility. Sergei, absolutely delighted that you're here with us today. It's been too long since we've seen you last, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts about 2021 and further out, and of course, the increasingly difficult political environment which is shaping the trade relationship between Russia, the UK, and other partners. Over to you, Sergei.
Thank you very much, Alf. This honor and pleasure to be back to RBCC. Indeed, I'll talk about economics first and foremost. The political factors will, of course, play a role, but I'll focus on economics, but we'll be happy to take questions about politics as well. So we agreed that I'll speak for about 40 minutes. I'll actually try to be shorter. I have lots of slides, but I'll skip some of them in order to have time for questions. So first and foremost, to put ourselves in context, Russia is facing a major economic stagnation. So if many of you remember the first Putin decade, this is the decade where Russian economy was growing at 7% per year, which is the fastest recorded decade of economic growth in Russian history. Russia doesn't have a long economic history. The data pretty much started 1885. But generally, we saw that this growth was due to higher oil prices, growth in oil prices, reforms undertaken in the 1990s, reforms undertaken under Putin's first term. And then we saw that these reforms were rolled back. There was an increase of the role of the state, increase of corruption, which actually retreated in the beginning of the century. And so once the crisis hit and the crisis was overcome, we saw the incoming stagnation. And so these are just the numbers I'm showing you to emphasize how big the difference is between the first and second Putin decade. So we are now, even before COVID, saw a 1% per year growth. If you actually look at the numbers we have for the next 5 years, and for example, rely on IMF data, you see that the growth rate in COVID and post-COVID years on average would be 1% per year. So this is what some people would call a middle income trap. And I think what is striking is the comparison with the South Korea. So if you move South Korea by 11 years back, so you can compare Russia and Korea, which would develop in a similar way. So they would be not just with the same growth rates, but similar income levels until about 10 years ago, when Korea, after its own crisis in the 1990s, rebuilt a new model and became a post-industrial knowledge-based economy and continued to grow, while Russia, after the first decade of Putin, started to stagnate. And GDP today is only a little bit higher than GDP per capita in 2008. And whoever would predict that Russia would be able to escape middle income trap like South Korea did, and South Korea did not waste a good crisis of 1998, Russia apparently has not succeeded in doing that. Middle income trap is a concept in economics. It's a very controversial concept, but it's a concept which says that you have certain sources of growth that bring you to middle income, and then unfortunately the further growth from middle income to high income requires different sources of growth, different political, legal, economic institutions. And if the previous status quo legacy institutions overstay their welcome, you run out of growth because the old sources of growth are exhausted and the new sources of growth are not found. And this is the striking contrast between, say, Russia and South Korea, which shows how some countries get stuck in middle income trap and some actually overcome the middle income trap and continue to grow. So this is just a background against which we should discuss 2020. Russia enters 2020 with a very ossified economy, which has not been growing for a decade, with a political system which is not very responsive, however, with very robust macroeconomic framework. And so today I'll talk about what happened in 2020, and I'll also give you some indications of what we should expect in the longer run, whether we should expect economic growth and diversification after Russia reemerges from the COVID. So in 2020, I would mention several things, and all these things are controversial. So Russia is very proud, and in quantitative terms, deservingly so, of the economic decline in Russia in 2020 being smaller than in most other G20 countries. And this is actually true despite very limited fiscal support. So the other thing is the COVID pandemic. Vladimir Putin often says that Russia has done a great job in managing COVID pandemic, but this is not exactly true if you look at excess mortality. And so I'll go through that as well. Another thing is vaccinations. Russia has done a great job developing the Sputnik vaccine, and there are other vaccines which are coming up as well. It's not yet clear to what extent Russia has formally completed the final stage of tests of Sputnik, but at least the interim results of the third stage are very good. And so many countries recognize how successful Russia has been in developing the vaccine. However, in terms of vaccination efforts, Russia is not doing very well. So let me show you some numbers regarding those things, and then try to connect the dots and explain how these three things are related to each other and how we should make sense of what happened in Russia in 2020. So these are the numbers about economic growth. This is the most recent OECD outlook, which just was unrolled a couple of days ago. So Russia here you see that Russia's decline in 2020 was similar to that of G20 and the world, and much smaller than most G20 countries, actually. There are some G20 countries which have done reasonably well, but Russian decline was about 4%, actually below 4%. And Russia is expected to grow back to pre-COVID GDP levels either by the end of 2021 or sometime in the first half of 2022, which is not necessarily the case in other developed countries. So when you just look at the projection of what we should expect by the end of 2021 relative to the expected level of GDP made before the pandemic, Russia would be below what it would be expected. So Russia, without COVID, would probably grow at 2% per year in 2019, 20, and 21. This time around, it will lose growth in 2020, and the recovery will not fully get it back to the trend. It will probably get back to the level, but not to the trend. So Russia would be below its projected pre-pandemic levels, but this gap is much smaller than the world on average and much smaller than for the most countries in the world. So US is expected to get back to the trend. China would be around the trend. Japan would be around the trend. But all other countries and the world on average are actually doing much worse than projected before COVID epidemic. So Euro area would be something like 4 percentage points below the trend. The world is well 3 percentage below. Great Britain also almost 5 percentage points below. And in that sense, Russia has not done badly in economic terms. And what is striking about it is how stingy Russia was. So, of course, Russia experienced an oil shock, and like Saudi Arabia, it was hit by lower oil prices. But this shock was short-lived, and oil prices recovered to reasonably comfortable levels. Of course, Russia reduced exports due to the OPEC plus deal, but still, Russia does have a rainy day fund, the National Welfare Fund. And this fund today is actually greater than it was a year ago, larger. So Russia did not spend much. And if you look at the IMF Fiscal Policy Monitor, and this is the data from IMF Fiscal Policy Monitor, which looks at additional spending or foregone revenues, this is the blue bar, and the orange bar is equity injections, grants, asset purchases, and assumption of debt. The total package Russia has is about 4.5%, 3% in blue, and 1.5% of GDP in total. In orange, sorry. In total would be 3 plus 1.5, 4.5%. So relative to other countries, to developed countries, but also to say China or Brazil or even India, Russia is much more stingy. Even relative to the world on average, Russia is much more stingy. And this is, of course, sometimes is discussed in terms of Russia is not a developed country, it cannot borrow at low interest rates. This is correct. However, Russia does have this rainy day fund, and 2020 was a rainy day. And so it is striking that Russia decided not to spend too much. So what can explain that? Why Russia managed actually to avoid a larger decline in GDP in 2020 and still didn't have to roll out a big fiscal package? There are a few explanations. One is structure of the economy. Russian economy is much more reliant on bigger firms, on state-owned firms, and is less dependent on travel and tourism. Russian economy is already quite isolated from the global economy, so closure of borders is not as costly for Russia as it is for economies relying on value chain trade, global value chains, on tourism, and so on. Another thing is small business share. So if you look at the employment in small business, in Russia, we are talking about 20% of labor force or 10% of population employed in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. This is about half of what the West would have. And actually, most emerging markets would also have a lot of people formally or informally employed in smaller business. And of course, smaller businesses hit much more during a crisis like this. So this is kind of the economic explanation why Russian economy didn't suffer as much. The second explanation is health-wise. Russia did not de facto stop its economy. So there was a lockdown which was announced in the spring 2020, but it was not as strictly enforced. And then the second thing is, even though we think lockdown really happened, we can't easily explain why so many Russians died in 2020. So the official data suggests that Russia's done an extremely good job in terms of COVID cases and deaths. However, if you look at the actual data on excess mortality, you see that lots of Russians died, but Russians didn't know about that because they were told that COVID is not as scary. The risks are lower than they believed, and in that sense, they shouldn't worry too much. So let me show you some data. So this also comes from OECD, where I plot the percentage of GDP generated by travel and tourism, and GDP growth in 2020. And the line here is a non-linear trend. So linear trend, as you can imagine, would go like this as well. But what is striking here is that Russia, which is this dot here, Russia has 5% of GDP generated by tourism and trade. Russia is exactly at the trend line. So France and Great Britain have much more tourism, and even with that tourism, they were hit much more than average country with the same level of tourism. Greece and Israel have much more tourism, but they were not hit in a worse much more so, because the trend line here is not that bad. But in any event, Russian lower decline, which is less than 4% of GDP in 2020, can be explained by its lower share of tourism if you compare it to, say, Portugal or Greece, which generate 15 or 20% of their GDP in travel and tourism. And in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that Russia was hit not as badly.
Sergei,
Sergei,
sorry, your slides haven't moved. James, can you sort that out?
Oh, I'm very sorry.
Yeah.
So you've seen the first slide all this time?
Yeah. No, we're on fiscal policy response to COVID-19.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you see the fiscal response now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Can you see the next slide? Slide number 8? No.
No. Still on.
Okay. Let me stop sharing and reshare again.
Yeah. Sorry,
okay. Thanks for mentioning this. I think it's important.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see slide number 8 now?
No, it's James, I'll let you take over because you're more adept at these things.
Okay.
Sergei, it's still not loading.
Stop sharing again and let me reshare.
Yep.
Let me reshare again. Can you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see slide number 8?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Good. Okay. Okay.
Great. Thanks.
So sometimes there is a delay, so I'll mention that. Yeah. So what I was talking about is indeed in Russia, the share of micro, small, and medium-sized employment is pretty much half of Europe, UK, or US. And I showed you also this chart, which is now supposed to show where you see the scatter plot and a non-linear trend of correlation between percent of GDP from travel and tourism and GDP decline in 2020. And you see that Russia, which is 5 percentage point of GDP generated by travel and tourism, and minus 3.7% or 3.5% decline in 2020 as estimated by OECD. So Russia is pretty much a normal country in that sense. Yes, Greece, Israel, Portugal suffered more, but this is because these countries are so much more specialized and dependent in tourism and dependent travel as well. Okay, so slide number 9 is very, very important. So this slide is coming from a publication by Dmitry Kobak, who is a scholar in Germany, who compared reported COVID deaths and excess mortality. So what is excess mortality? Excess mortality is when you look at the pre-COVID trend in mortality and compare projected 2020 mortality and actual 2020 mortality. And so in Russia, the gap between the two is something like 360,000 people. Official deaths in 2020, if you just add up all numbers reported by Russian government as COVID deaths, this number would be in the range of 60,000. So basically, Russia is the world champion of the ratio of actual COVID mortality and reported COVID mortality. The difference is 6.5 times. So the numbers in brackets here are sources. DK stands for Dmitry Kobak. You see that if you look at 2020 excess mortality in absolute numbers, then Russia will only be second to United States, which had more deaths in absolute numbers. However, if you look at per capita excess mortality, then in the US, of course, US is a much bigger country, so it's 137 deaths per 100,000 population in the US, and 256 deaths per 100,000 population in Russia. In that sense, among the 20 biggest losers from COVID, Russia is only second to Peru, and close to some other countries, but in Europe, Russia has done much worse. But Russia is a world champion in terms of underreporting of COVID deaths. And this number that I'm talking about now, the excess mortality, is not secret. You can actually calculate it yourself using official data from Rosstat. However, this number is, of course, not discussed on Russian TV. Russian TV looks at the 60,000 number, the official number. If you use this number that Russia has done in absolute terms, has done much better than France or United Kingdom. But that, of course, is just a falsification. It's just a manipulation of the data. So this is a very important chart that explains to you what has actually happened. Russia has lost a lot of lives. And the reason for that was, first, Russians didn't know that COVID is going to be very costly and it is very dangerous. And second, because of the lack of fiscal supports, Russians could not stay at home. They had to continue working. They had to go outside because they had no income to support themselves and stay at home at the same time. And so this is something that you can see in what's called mobility data. So if you look at Google or Apple data, they give you the measures of how much time people make, how much time people spend walking or driving or being in parks or shops or workplaces. And so here is Apple mobility data on walking and driving. And you see a big decline in April and May. And so Russians stopped walking and driving by 60%. So it's a huge decline, but then the recovery was very quick, and it's never been below the pre-COVID levels. And actually today, if you compare year on year, you basically get that walking and driving is higher than in pre-COVID times, roughly equal to what it was a year ago, but it's definitely not lower. So this is something that you definitely see in the daily data. So since we are Russian-British business chamber, I can give you a number for UK. Here in the UK, Apple also collects data on transit. And so what I would mention here, the decline in the UK in driving and walking was 60% plus in April. But what is more important, it didn't recover so much more in the summer. And after the summer, it became lower. It went lower than in pre-COVID times. And actually today, both driving and walking are 15-20% below what it was a year ago in the beginning of 2020. And if you compare these two charts, you see a huge difference between Russia and the UK, especially after the summer, where UK observed stricter rules while Russia didn't. And this is especially striking given that Russia is so much ahead of the UK in excess mortality. So if you compare this bar here of 360 plus to these bars for UK and France, you see that Russia is ahead in total numbers, but also in numbers per capita. So this is number per capita, number of excess deaths per capita in Russia and UK and France. So Russia is kind of twice, 2.5 times ahead of France and 1.5 times ahead of UK. And yet Russia is much less careful in terms of introducing restrictions. And just since I'm based in France, this is the same graph in France, which looks much more like UK than like Russia. And what is also striking about France is how strict the lockdown was in the first wave, when the activity went down by more than 80% rather than 60%. And today we're still kind of below the pre-COVID times. And as we speak today, France is moving in the new lockdown in half of the country at midnight tonight. So Russians did not really stay home. And that explains why economy was not suffering so much, but it also explains why deaths were so many. Now, another thing is vaccination. If you listen to Vladimir Putin, you hear that Russia's done extremely well introducing the vaccine, being first in the world, registering the vaccine and starting the mass vaccination campaign. So the registration business, of course, again, a lie, because Russia registered the vaccine before launching the third stage of tests, and several other vaccines were ahead of Russian vaccine. But what is even more important is the rate of vaccination. And here I'm showing Israel, UK, US, European Union as a total, and Russia. As you know, in European Union, you have a really slow vaccination process, well behind UK. European Commission's justly criticized for that, but even with that, EU is twice as fast as Russia, where number of vaccinations per capita is still very small. And this is, it's very hard to explain. So in some regions, they say that vaccines are in short supply, like in the EU. But in many places, vaccines are not in short supply, and Moscow is one of those. And your friends in Moscow, your colleagues in Moscow can vaccinate themselves at any moment. And it's very easy to do. And yet vaccination is not picking up. And the answer is because there is a huge mistrust in vaccine Sputnik's safety. And that is probably the result of back and forth propaganda on how dangerous COVID is and whether you need to vaccinate and how reliable the tests are. But this is yet another matter, and I'm just giving you the numbers. So just to summarize the takeaways from what I've just said is in Russia in 2020, economy has done reasonably well, better than in many, many other countries. And the explanation for that is, first, Russia has a structure of the economy which is less vulnerable to the pandemic. Russia is less dependent on tourism and travel. Russia, because of the sanctions probably, has been more isolated than other economies. And second, lockdown was either not officially strict or was not enforced. Judging by mobility data, Russians were either not willing or not able to stay home. And part of the not able part is fiscal stinginess of the Russian government. Russian government did not roll out a major fiscal package, and so Russians could not afford to stay at home. So that, of course, resulted in high excess mortality, but Russians don't know about this. So this is one of the biggest paradoxes. So Russia is a world champion in terms of this gap between underreported, reported and total mortality of COVID. And yet Russians don't know that. Russians believe official numbers because propaganda still controls the overall media sources. And in that sense, the costs, the huge life costs of COVID is not fully understood by Russians. And then the second part, and this is also quite tragic, is Russia cannot produce enough vaccines, and also the lack of trust in government undermines vaccination rates. And yet Russians believe that Sputnik is a great success. And the development of Sputnik is overall a great success. So, for example, I live in France, where its own vaccine has not been developed. It's failed, and also with all the success of AstraZeneca, it is still less effective than Sputnik. Yet what we see is the development of Sputnik doesn't help to roll out a mass vaccination campaign. So this is where we are in 2020. However, at some point, Russia will get vaccinated, economy will reopen, and we'll go back to this picture that I mentioned to you. So Russian economy shrank by about 4% in 2020, but it will grow by almost 3% in 2021 and 2022. So it will be back on track. But what is this track? What is the post-COVID trajectory of Russian growth and development? And the answer is Russia will continue to stagnate. I showed you this graph with a projection from IMF, and IMF projects that Russian economy will continue growing at 2%, which means it will be falling behind the world more and more. So the question is why? What are the factors that can accelerate Russian growth, can diversify its economy? And this is where I'll be extremely brief, because I think we all have discussed those issues many, many times, and I'll just give you some slides to show that nothing has changed so far. What was the problem before COVID is not gone. So, of course, every country has several fundamental sources of long-term growth, which is geography, natural resources, human capital, quality of legal, political, and economic institutions, and what's called culture. The social capital, trust, norms, attitudes, beliefs, values, society's preferences, which more and more are viewed as a source of growth itself. And of course, in Russia, growth can only come from non-oil sector. And we also know how these sectors develop, and South Korea is one of those examples. You need good institutions, you need competition, you need openness, you need skills, and you need financial sector, competitive financial sector. All of you know Russia very well, so you know how Russia fares on all these dimensions. I would just say that on culture, people usually don't get a quantitative estimate of that, but there is a paper. Two of my colleagues, Jan Algan and Pierre Cayuc, have studied the impact of social trust on economic growth, and they identify a causal effect. And so their estimation is that if Russia had as much social capital as Sweden, Russian GDP per capita would be 85% higher. So that is one other potential source of growth that Russia would have, reasonably less well known than all other factors. So on all other factors, I'll just show you this graph on how corrupt Russia is. So if you look at pre-COVID GDP per capita and level of control of corruption, you see that Russia is well below the trend line. So Russia is, of course, not as rich as Singapore, Norway, Luxembourg, but Russia is an upper middle income country. And there are some other countries like this. So Uruguay, for example, has similar income level, or Chile has a similar income level. They're a bit richer than Russia, but they're much less corrupt. Here, if you are higher, you're less corrupt. If you're lower, you're more corrupt. And in those terms, Russia is as corrupt as many other oil-rich countries, and it's much more corrupt than an average country in this income category. And so if Russia were to improve its institutions, that would be one of the sources of growth. On human capital, there are many, many things we need to discuss. Skills, demographics, poor health of senior cohorts, and immigration. And I'll skip most of those slides, and I'll happy to show those slides and talk about them. But basically, Russians still have good skills, even controlling for quality of higher education in Russia. Russians still have good IT skills. Russian senior cohorts have reasonably good skills, which is actually quite an exception among East European countries. Yet Russia is an aging country, and one of the things which people sometimes count on is that Russia, with its so-called pension reform, will now have better demographics because all the Russians will work. Now, the problem is these people can't really work much because they have poor health. And this is a major problem for Russia. And then we have a brain drain and immigration, which is very hard to quantify. And so I will just skip through that. Let me mention that Russia has done a reasonably good job in terms of raising fertility through what's called maternity capital, but still Russia cannot go back to the above 2 levels of birth per woman. Russia is a normal industrialized country, and its fertility levels are below 2, so Russia will suffer, and Russia will actually suffer also because of the shorter cohorts moving into its 20s right now, And so this is the same actually in all Eastern European countries. So Russia is not an exception, but Russia will have more and more problems with aging, and this aging will accelerate. Let me keep skipping the slides. Labor force will actually start declining in Russia, and Russia will grow old before it gets rich. So let me actually skip all the slides. One of the things which advanced economies do, they robotize, thinking that they don't need as many workers because they will have more robots. And here I should say that Russia is below the trend. So if you look at countries which have the same age of workers, like Russia, some of them, for example, like Poland or Slovakia, these countries have many more robots per capita. Even Turkey has more robots per capita than Russia. And so Russia here is also suffering from lack of investment in modern technology. Now, one of the things that I mentioned is that all the Russian cohorts don't participate in economic activity, and the reason for that is poor health. If you look at how people feel in Russia and ask yourself, do Russians actually feel well relative to, for example, Western countries, average Russian would say, yes, I feel well. I'm not unhealthy. Relative to other emerging markets or EBRD countries or emerging Europes, Russians are actually quite optimistic regarding their health up until 50. And after 50, their self-perceived health is falling drastically for men and especially so for women. So we shouldn't expect Russians to work a lot after they turn 55 or 60. However, still skills, as I said, are strong. So here is quality-adjusted quantity of education in Russia. And Russia, in that sense, is as educated as most developed economies. Blue dots here are developed economies. The diamonds are Eastern Europe. And Russia is the champion in Eastern Europe. And it's as good as most developed economies, only behind Singapore. So, and this is actually true when you look at skills of the workforce measured by special OECD program called PIAC or STEP, where it's not just quantity or quality of education, but your ability to solve problems, to work with sophisticated technology. And actually, Russian workforce is still the champion among emerging Europe and close to or above most advanced economies. So the dots here are OECD countries. These dots here in this area are OECD countries. So Russia is not as bad as people would think. And in that sense, we have this analysis where you have to think about long-term growth. On one hand, you can be optimistic about human capital, meaning skills, but pessimistic about human capital, meaning demographics. On the other hand, you can be optimistic about macroeconomic policy, which is exemplary in Russia, and yet bad news is corruption, domination of the state, lack of rule of law, so quality of institutions is not helping. And in that sense, it's very hard to project, it's very hard to forecast the future, because if you believe that Russia will reform its institutions and remove corruption, become a competitive and open economy, and reintroduce rule of law, then Russia has a lot of potential to catch up with advanced economies because its skills are at the level of advanced economies. If you think that the current political system and the current legal system is going to stay in place, and so quality of institutions will change, then corruption will destroy investment and result in more brain drain and destroy the skill dividend. And so Russia will not catch up with the advanced economies. So this is unfortunately where I have to end without a definite answer what's going to happen to Russia in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years. As I said, we are pretty much in this stagnation scenario, at least if you believe the IMF, where we will go through the status quo, where Russia will be slowly losing its skill dividend without reforming its political and legal institutions. So let me stop here.
Sergei, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture or presentation. Very, very interesting. We've got quite a few questions, so I'll start straight away. The first one's from Jared Michael McCarthy, and he asks, added to the lots of negative international PR, Biden's speech this week, the COVID situation, economic stagnation, etc., it sounds like there's not much reason to be optimistic about working in Russia from an international point of view. Should we all be packing our bags, or do you see any real opportunity remaining for foreign businesses and business people committed to the market?
Thanks, Alf. Assets are worth as much as they're worth. So if you're more optimistic than the market, then you should do business in Russia. If you are less pessimistic than the market, you should sell to the market and leave. So the fact that Russian assets are now worth half the levels of other emerging markets at the same income level suggests that market on average is worried about all kinds of risks, such as expropriation or being put in jail or unfair competition, inability to contest in a proper court of law. So all these risks are there, investors are aware of them. So if you think that you know how to overcome those risks, you shouldn't pack. There are opportunities. Russia is a huge market, but there is a reason why assets are cheap. And so I will just give you a reference to the story of Michael Calvi, who has been a very shrewd investor, who's made a lot of money in Russia, actually built a number of companies through being one of the biggest private equity investor in non-oil companies in Russia. And yet he faced his nemesis. One of his partners turned out to be too well connected to the FSB, and that cost Michael both money and freedom. So Michael, I think, still is under house arrest, and he did spend some time in jail. So if you're happy to take those risks, why not? If you're enticed by low valuations in Russian market, why not? Overall, there is a scenario where there is some kind of political change, some kind of change in economic institutions. You can imagine that assets that are so cheap today will eventually become more expensive. And the only risk is that in the process of political change, the current shareholders may be expropriated several times. And so if you just invest and think that you can invest and hold for the next 20 years, it's a great strategy. And in 20 years, Russian assets should be more expensive. But the problem is that in the process, you may be expropriated several times. So I can only tell you that the assets are worth as much as they're valued by the market. And there is a reason for that. So I can't really say. But Russia is a big market. Russia is a very sophisticated market. Russia has some world-class companies such as Yandex. Yandex would be worth much more if not for sanctions and all kinds of internet regulations that Russia does. So anyway, I won't be too pessimistic. But right now, the very fact that assets are so cheap suggests that it's not just me who suggests that quality of institutions is not great, but the market consensus is like this.
Thank you, Sergei. Is Michael Calvi a one-off, or do you think it could happen to other foreign investors?
Well, before Michael Calvi suffered from that, if you ask him, he would say Khodorkovsky's one-off, or Abizov's one-off, or Ulikaev's one-off. Yeah. And I think in Russia, the best forecast is never say never. And as they would say, never say never again, right? Yeah. So before it happens, you think it can never happen. The red lines are crossed every week. And so you mentioned Biden's assessment of what Mr. Putin is. It is kind of an unprecedented statement. And I won't be surprised that if we have unprecedented events every week, and we've seen that for many, many years by now. So in that sense, it's never one-off. And so I would recommend to take learn lessons from Calvi's experience, and for example, never cross investors who are too connected to FSB, for example. So never challenge them. So.
Right. Okay, thank you. The next question is from Kendrick White, and he asks, Are large-scale Russian enterprises investing in modernizing themselves to compete globally, or are they also stagnating?
It's great to hear from Kendrick. Kendrick was also a one-off before Michael called me, but it's great that Kendrick is free and can ask questions on Zoom. So he was actually attacked, even though Kendrick has spent so much time and effort in order to develop innovation sector in Russia, and I have great respect for what Kendrick has done. So regarding the large Russian companies, of course they invest, and some of them are quite successful. One of the companies which recently has been a lot in the news is, for example, Sibur, that's investing in the modern technology. I'm hearing a lot about Russian steel makers who follow European Green Deal very closely and are investing and will invest in green steel making, because they know that European market may be very hard to enter for old style technology in the coming years because of border tax adjustment. So there are many very sophisticated companies in Russia, but on average investment is low. So one big number that I would like to mention is share of investment to GDP. So you go back to 2011, Mr. Putin runs for president again, and he says, I have a great economic program, and my program will raise investment from 20% of GDP to 27% of GDP by 2018. 2018 comes, investment to GDP is still 20%. So Mr. Putin says, now I'm coming again as a president, and I have a brand new economic strategy that will raise investment from 20% of GDP to 25% of GDP, this time more modest. Huh? And a few years go by, and even before pandemic, it stays at 20% of GDP, 20, 21% of GDP. There is no indication that the strategy will pay off. And capital outflow continues, despite very low valuations of Russian assets. These are not just foreign investors who don't invest in Russia. These are Russian investors themselves that are taking money from Russia to the West. Even though interest rates in Russia are higher, even though assets are cheap, Russians prefer to take money outside and invest at zero interest rates or negative interest rates outside. Why? Because of all those risks that I mentioned. So there are examples of great successes in investment in Russian companies, but on average, Russia still does not invest.
Thank you, Sergei. The next question is from Denis Uvarov, and he asks, how immune or susceptible is Russian tech sector to the overall economic stagnation?
Well, tech sector by definition must be operating in the global economy. Tech sector is where size matters, scale matters. And of course, all these recent events with the sanctions and attitudes of venture capital and private equity towards Russian companies doesn't help. And the best Russian tech entrepreneurs relocate to wherever. Some of them move to Belarus, and now they move from Belarus further on. Some of them move to Ukraine, but most of them, of course, move to Silicon Valley, and you have world-class tech entrepreneurs operating in Silicon Valley, or now moving from Silicon Valley to Florida, or Texas. But there are some companies which remain in Russia, and we see how Yandex, being hit by all kinds of regulations, reinvents itself, changing its governance structure over and over again in a very innovative way, and still showing amazing resilience. And so this is probably one great example of a Russian tech company that manages to overcome all kinds of problems. But some companies relocate, and a couple of very impressive companies established by Russian entrepreneurs, Sergei Belousov, Acronis, and Parallels. My understanding is they completely moved away from Russia. And even if they have some workforce in Russia, their headquarters are outside of Russia. So this unfortunately happens. And so these are risks which are very, very hard to overcome. And you can say that Sberbank, the institution formerly known as Sberbank, which is now known as Sber, now is trying to sell itself as a tech company. And of course, Sber is doing extremely well. immune to all kinds of risks. It's under sanctions, but the sanctions are not really scary. But Sber cannot expand outside of Russia. It actually sold its Turkish operation, which was great, which was a very impressive bank. But now within Russia, it's doing reasonably well.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Niraj Shah, and he asks, what do you think Russia should do to get out of the middle income trap?
Well, this is a very simple question. And I mentioned South Korea because South Korea is, and this is something that I've studied myself and published papers on this. South Korea did not waste a good crisis. So before 1998, South Korean growth was running out of steam. Prior to 1998, South Korean growth model was based on chaebols, on anti-competitive institutions where new entrants and foreign entrants were in some cases legally not allowed to enter new industries. And the crisis undermined the legitimacy of this model, and pro-competitive reforms, which were designed before the crisis by Koreans themselves, but they were imposed by IMF, opened opportunities for new entrants. Some chaebols were actually closed, some chaebols were restructured, and now South Korea, with the new kinds of chaebols that reinvented themselves, and the new non-chaebols investors and foreign investors, is a modern, knowledge-based, post-industrial economy that has done really great in terms of investment in high technology, in terms of patenting, and so on. So in case of Russia, we need something like this. And we need, and this is since Alf mentioned political issues in the beginning, we need political change. I don't believe that this particular political system is capable of reforming the economy, reforming the institutions, reintroducing rule of law, opening up the relationship with the rest of the world. Russia needs openness. Russia needs to overcome isolation. Russia needs to reduce the role of the state. Russia needs competition. And all of that, I think, will require political change, because this political leadership is not interested in those reforms. And it's actually worried that if these reforms are implemented, then the newly powerful middle class, all those tech entrepreneurs, will ask for political change themselves. So I don't expect this political regime to implement this change. But if suddenly Martians take over the Kremlin and ask me for advice, I would tell them, do all of that. Reduce role of the state, welcome back foreign investors, overcome isolation, promote competition, and reintroduce rule of law.
Great, thank you very much. Next question is from Yuri Praslov, and he asks, how trustworthy are sources indicating the discrepancy between actual and reported COVID deaths in Russia? So
they're very trustful, and occasionally Russian government officials would actually admit that this is true. And basically what this data talk about is mortality. So what you do, you just go to website of Rosstat and look at mortality in 2020. And even by Rosstat official data, mortality in 2020 was higher than mortality in 2019 by 320,000 people. And then you look at monthly data, because you need to subtract mortality in the first quarter of 2020, because in the first quarter, mortality was actually below the corresponding level of 2019. And then you immediately get a number like this. Then you can do some more statistical work by looking for the trend, because before 2020, Russian mortality was actually coming down, not up. And so if you compare the mortality in 2020 in the second, third, and fourth quarter to this trend, you immediately arrive at this number. And I can produce it myself just using official Rosstat data. So there is no question about this. So, and Russian government officials occasionally would say that yes, it's just they would never say that on TV, and they will continue to refer to official numbers on COVID deaths, which are extremely small, and say, well, we have this official website which tells you how many people die, and very few people die. And it's still not few, in a sense, 300 or 400 or 500 people die every day. But the total is 6 times as small as the actual number. And this is pretty scary. And this is, by the way, why I think vaccination is also not progressing as fast, because the actual number of people who went through COVID and don't need to get vaccinated immediately, people with antibodies, is much higher in Russia than we think. It may well be the case that half of Russians have already gone through COVID, because official data are so misleading. But overall, I have complete confidence in this chart. I think this is coming from official data, and this is very easy to reproduce.
Great. Thank you, Sergei. Next question is from Yulia Toksarova, and she asks, is the future in tech companies or banks? And follows on, how can tech startups compete with large international banks? And you've mentioned Sberbank already.
Russia is a place where you have lots of talented people, well-educated in computer science as well. And you can see that in the recent intelligence community report in the US. Today there is a scandal as well in Bulgaria. So when their talents are put to the wrong use, you see how capable they are to hack very sophisticated computer systems in the West. But some of them actually go for fintech, and they do a great job. And Alf mentioned that I was running economic school before leaving for France. And there I had a student, Nikolai Staronsky, who now is one of the most successful fintech entrepreneurs in the UK. He's established a company called Revolut, which competes successfully with big banks in payment systems. And so he's not alone. You also have TransferWise, which is an Estonian company. And there are many challengers in this business. And I think this is why Sberbank wants to become a tech company, because tech companies are valued so highly, and they are also very capable in competition with traditional banks. So I think that if suddenly Russia is a better place to do business, we can actually see more and more modern innovation in fintech, but not just in fintech. It's also green technology, also online education systems, also digital health. All of that will come up in Russia if there is a better business climate.
Great, thank you. Out of interest, Tinkoff, do you put them up there as a tech company?
So this is a great question. So relative to Revolut, it's a legacy bank.
Mm-hmm.
And Tinkoff was actually very jealous of Revolut. And then relative to Sberbank, it's of course a high-tech bank. It's a great, agile company which was built from scratch and shows how ingenious Russian entrepreneurs are.
Great, thanks. Sergei, it's been fascinating. We're going to have to draw a close very soon. I think there's time for one more question, and it's on probably the most important topic of the moment, coronavirus. And it's from Yuri Praslov, and he asked, how do you estimate AstraZeneca's plans to produce coronavirus serum in Russia for non-EU markets? And do you think there's a place for joint cooperation, I'm guessing with Russian manufacturers because of that?
So currently we don't see that Russian pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity is up to speed. Russia is well behind its promises and announcements and plans to produce many millions of vaccines for outside world and for Russia itself. But Russia has allowed for AstraZeneca to be produced in Russia. And if that happens, I'll be extremely happy. There are, however, plans for Russian vaccine to be produced in Italy, in India. I would be very happy if that happens, because this is a global challenge. And before we address the pandemic challenge globally, we are not done. And so here I think this is a common cause. As you can see, I am very unhappy about what Russian government does. And I generally agree with Mr. Biden, with President Biden, on his assessment of Mr. Putin's responsibility for political killings. I strongly believe that Alexei Navalny should be freed. But I think that doesn't mean that, as President Biden would say, that we cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. There is a scope for cooperation on vaccinations. There is a scope for cooperation on nuclear weapons, on Iran, and on climate change. And vaccination is the most urgent project. And I think if Russia and Europe and UK and the US can do the world a better place in terms of vaccine production, it should be done.
Great. Well, Sergei, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. We'll have to draw stumps here. Thank you very much again. I know your time is very valuable. It's been a fascinating insight, and we're honored to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you as well for joining. I hope you've enjoyed that. And as I said, we've recorded this for posterity and it'll be posted on the website either today or on Monday. And if you're interested in Sergei's presentation, we'll make that available to you as well. Our program's full of great events. Please have a look on the website. The next one's on the 26th of March, when Into Matrix will also be talking about COVID-19 and giving us an update, and I hope you'll join us then. But in the meantime, have a fantastic weekend. Sergei, thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sergei.